The morning Sylvie Marchand walked through the greenhouse doors at the Pemberton County Agricultural Fair, she laughed. Not the polite, uncertain laugh of someone who does not know what she is looking at. It was the deliberate laugh of someone who knows exactly what she is looking at and has decided it does not deserve a second thought. A folding table, a hand-lettered sign, 3 mason jars of preserves and a tray of small, irregular pastries under a square of cheesecloth. And behind the table a man in a worn canvas jacket with flowers still on his left cuff and a 7-year-old boy beside him holding a small wooden spoon like it was something worth holding. Sylvie ran Marchand Fine Foods. She had built the company from a single Quebec City storefront into a national brand with 17 product lines, 4 distribution contracts, and a recurring segment on a morning television show where she demonstrated techniques that home cooks found reassuring and professional cooks found occasionally impressive. She had judged 2 national culinary competitions, chaired the Food Innovation Panel at the Ottawa Terroir Summit, and she had absolutely no idea that the man standing behind that folding table was about to take the $3 million prize at the Canadian Heritage Kitchen Championship and change the direction of her company in the process. Keep listening, because what Lorne Callahan built in his kitchen took 4 years and 1 weekend to prove everyone wrong. Lorne had a morning routine that did not change. Every day at 6, before his son Theo woke up, before the house made any sound at all, he came downstairs in his socks and put the kettle on. He had done it since the autumn Patricia died, and he had never examined why he kept setting out 2 mugs when the second one sat on the windowsill cooling untouched. He would drink his own at the kitchen counter, looking out at the backyard where the raised beds were, and at the small shed at the end of the garden where he kept the fermentation crocks, and the drying racks and the notebooks going back 6 years. The notebooks were the record of something that had started as distraction and become, without his quite deciding it, the most serious work of his life. Lorne had trained as a food scientist. He had spent 9 years at a mid-sized ingredient manufacturer in Hamilton, developing preservation compounds and texture stabilizers for the processed food industry, the kind of work that was precise and demanding and almost completely invisible to anyone who did not understand what it required. He had been good at it. He had also, in the last 2 years before his contract ended, been developing something of his own on his own time, a fermentation method using wild-harvested Ontario botanicals that produced a depth of flavor in preserved foods that conventional processing methods simply could not replicate. The process was slow, temperature-sensitive, and could not be easily scaled without losing the quality that made it worth scaling. It was also, in his considered judgment, genuinely new. He had brought the concept to his supervisor, Ross Edgerton, in the way you bring a thing to someone you trust, which is to say without protection and without reservation. He had laid out the method, the test results, the flavor profiles. Ross had listened with interest and told him the company would evaluate it in their next innovation review. 6 weeks after that conversation, Lorne received his non-renewal notice. 3 months after that, Marchand Fine Foods announced a new premium preserves line featuring what their press release described as a proprietary botanical fermentation process developed by their culinary science team. Lorne had read the press release at his kitchen table. He had read it twice. Then he had put it down, made dinner for Theo, helped with homework, and gone out to the shed after Theo was asleep and sat there for a long time in the dark between the crocks and the notebooks. Patricia had been alive then. She had come out to the shed after an hour and sat on the stool beside him without asking questions, which was one of the things about her that he had never found a way to explain to anyone who hadn't witnessed it. She understood that some things needed to be sat with before they could be spoken. He had started rebuilding the method from scratch that same week, and he had not stopped. Theo was 7 now. He had been 3 when Patricia died, which meant he did not remember her the way Lorne did, in the particular fullness of an adult memory, but he carried her in the smaller, more durable way that young children carry things they have absorbed before they had language for them. He knew that the shed was important. He knew that the notebooks on the shelf above the workbench were not to be touched without asking. He knew that his father worked carefully and did not rush, and that when something in the kitchen smelled a certain way, something good was happening that would take time. He had named his wooden spoon captain. When Lorne asked him why, Theo looked at the spoon with the evaluating concentration that 7-year-olds bring to questions they take seriously, and said that a spoon was in charge of everything that went into the pot, and whoever was in charge of everything should have a title. Lorne had turned back to the stove and kept his face to himself for a moment before answering. The Canadian Heritage Kitchen Championship was announced in March. It was a national open competition in 2 divisions, traditional preservation and innovation, with a combined prize purse of $3 million awarded to the highest aggregate score across a 3-day judging event in Toronto. Entry was open to independent producers only, no commercial food manufacturers, no brands with national distribution. Lorne read the eligibility criteria 4 times. He called his sister Bev in Sudbury. He told no one else. The food producers market in Guelph ran every second Saturday through the spring and summer, and it was where Lorne had been selling his preserves for 2 years under the name Thornfield Kitchen. A name Theo had suggested because the thorn bushes grew along the back fence, and Theo thought thorns were interesting. The market had given Lorne something more useful than income, though the income was real. It had given him 100 conversations with people who ate his food and told him what they noticed, which was a form of feedback more honest than any laboratory panel and more useful to him than any professional review. Margaret Souza, who ran the neighboring baked goods table, had been the first person to ask him directly what he was doing differently. Not what was in the jars, but what he was doing to them. He had explained the fermentation method, and she had listened without interruption and then said quietly that she thought what he was describing was not a method so much as a philosophy, and that philosophy was the part that could not be copied. He had thought about that for several days. He registered for the championship in late April, drove to Toronto for the mandatory producer briefing, and was assigned a competition number and a prep kitchen slot. At the briefing, the event organizer mentioned that this year's judging panel would include Sylvie Marchand. Lorne did not react to this information visibly. He wrote it down in the small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket and drove back to Guelph in the dark. The Pemberton County Agricultural Fair happened in May, the weekend before the championship. Lorne had committed to the fair table months earlier, before he knew about the competition, and he kept the commitment because he did not cancel commitments, and because Theo had been looking forward to it since February, when they had booked the table together, and Theo had carefully printed their names on the registration form in his best handwriting. The fair drew a good crowd by mid-morning, and Lorne's table was doing steady business when Sylvie Marchand walked through the main greenhouse doors, with a group that included a photographer, an assistant carrying a production bag, and 2 men in the kind of casual clothes that cost more than most people's work clothes. Lorne recognized her immediately. He did not know why she was at a county agricultural fair, though he would learn later that she had agreed to a regional media feature on small-scale food producers and her team had selected the Pemberton Fair as a suitable backdrop. She was moving through the vendor rows with the practiced efficiency of someone who attends these events professionally and has learned to identify interest quickly and dismiss what is not interesting without breaking stride. She looked at the table across from Lorne's, the one with the bundled dried herbs and handmade sachets, and moved on. She looked at the honey operation 2 tables down, stopped briefly to ask a question, and moved on. And then her photographer pointed at Lorne's table, not because it was impressive, but because it was small and plain, and the child beside it was holding a wooden spoon and looking at the crowd with the unguarded attentiveness of a person who finds the world genuinely interesting. Sylvie moved toward the table. She looked at the mason jars arranged in a line, at the tray of small pastries under the cheesecloth, at the hand-lettered sign that said Thornfield Kitchen in Theo's handwriting. She looked at Lorne. Something registered, some small recognition that didn't quite resolve. She picked up one of the jars and read the label, which described the contents as wild botanical ferment mixed berry and listed the ingredients without the usual marketing language. She set the jar down. And then she said to the assistant beside her, and not to Lorne, that it was interesting what people called a process when they didn't have a process, and that fermentation was not a philosophy, it was a chemistry, and chemistry required investment and proper equipment, not a garden shed and a folding table at a county fair. The people nearby heard it. A few glanced over. Lorne straightened from the cooler he had been restocking and looked at her without hurry. He said, with the even delivery he used when explaining something to someone who genuinely might not know, that the botanical profile in the fermentation starter had been isolated and stabilized through a continuous wild culture method maintained without refrigeration over a 4-year period, that the resulting flavor compounds were distinct from any commercially available fermentation base he had encountered, and that if she would like to taste the result before drawing conclusions about the equipment used to produce it, there was an open jar on the left end of the table. Sylvie let him finish. She looked at the open jar. She did not taste it. She said that a product that couldn't scale had no future in the Canadian food market, and the Canadian food market was not waiting for someone's garden project to become something. She said it without cruelty but with total certainty, and then she turned and continued down the row. One of the men with her, the taller one with a lanyard that said Marchand Foods on it, paused at the edge of the table on his way past. He looked at the jars with an expression that Lorne read not as contempt but as something more careful, something like attention. He moved on without speaking. Theo had heard all of it. He looked up at his father and held Captain against his chest and waited to see what would happen to his father's face. Lorne crouched down until he was level with Theo's eyes and asked if he was okay. Theo said yes and asked if the lady had tasted anything. Lorne said she had not. Theo considered this and said that was too bad for her. Lorne agreed that it was Margaret from the baked goods table had watched the whole exchange. She caught Lorne's eye when he stood up and gave him a look that required no translation. That evening, after Theo was in bed and the jars from the fair were back on the cold room shelves, and the day's notes written up in the current notebook, Lorne sat at the kitchen table and opened the championship entry file on his laptop. He reviewed the submission categories and the judging criteria, and he made 3 small notations in the margin of the printed brief where he had been considering a conventional approach and now saw clearly that a conventional approach was not what he had or what he should present. He wrote a number in the margin. Days remaining and a second number beside it. He closed the laptop and went to bed. The problem with the championship was not the cooking. The problem was the documentation requirement, a written technical brief describing the producer's method, sourcing philosophy, and innovation rationale submitted 5 business days before the competition. Lorne had been a food scientist for 9 years. He was not afraid of documentation, but the brief required him to describe, in plain language accessible to both technical judges and culinary judges, why his method was different, and different in a way that the judges who had spent their careers in commercial food production would recognize as genuinely new rather than rustic or nostalgic or simply unsophisticated. He wrote the brief in 4 sessions spread across 2 weeks between Theo's school schedule and the fermentation crock rotations and 3 weekend market tables. He wrote it the way he wrote his lab notes, which was precisely and without flattery. He described the wild culture method in full. He described the 4 years of iteration and the specific failure points that had led him to the temperature management approach he now used. He described the flavor compounds he had identified and their distinction from commercially available profiles. He included a table of comparative results. He submitted it on the 4th business day, 1 day early, which was the kind of thing Lorne did. His sister Bev drove down from Sudbury to stay with Theo for the 3 days of the competition. Theo gave her a full briefing on Captain's responsibilities and the proper sequence for checking the fermentation crocks. Bev accepted this responsibility with appropriate seriousness. Lorne kissed Theo on the top of his head and drove to Toronto before the sun was up. The competition venue was a converted event hall in the distillery district, and the contrast between the production setups in the main hall captured something accurate about the range of ambition and resources that a national open competition attracts. 2 producers had brought full mobile kitchen setups with branded signage and support staff. 3 others had equipment that spoke of professional commercial kitchens and years of competition experience. Lorne had a single equipment case, his own knives, and the crocks and starter cultures he had transported in an insulated cooler in the back of his truck because no substitution was possible and no delay was recoverable. He had been assigned a station in the middle row which suited him. He set up without display. The placard provided by the competition organizers sat at the front of the station with his name and producer number. He did not add anything to it. Sylvie Marchand arrived with the judging panel at 9 on the first morning. She was composed in the way that people are composed when they have done a thing many times and know how to carry the authority of it. She moved through the introduction of the panel with the ease of someone who understands the difference between the role she is performing and the judgment she is actually forming, which was something Lorne observed from his station and recognized. She did not acknowledge him when the panel moved through the setup review. He did not expect her to. The first day of judging covered traditional preservation, and Lorne's wild botanical fermented apple butter was the last item reviewed in his category. The technical judge, a food scientist from the University of Guelph whose work Lorne had read and respected, spent 11 minutes at his station asking questions about the starter culture development. 11 minutes was longer than the review protocol called for. When he moved on, he did not say anything, but he wrote in his notes for a longer duration than Lorne had observed him writing at any previous station. Sylvie's review was shorter and more pointed. She asked 3 questions, all technical, none of them soft. He answered each one directly. She tasted the apple butter from the provided spoon, held it for a moment, and then asked a 4th question that was not on the standard judging sheet. She asked how he managed oxidation during the extended fermentation cycle, because the color stability in the sample was inconsistent with the process time he had described in his brief, and one of the 2 was wrong and she would like to know which. It was a good question. It was in fact the best question anyone had asked him about the process in 4 years of explaining it to people. He answered it completely. She made a note. She moved to the next station. The second evening of competition, after the Innovation Division prep session had closed, Lorne called Bev and then Theo. Theo reported that the crocs were fine and that he had explained the temperature protocol to B 3 times to make sure she understood. Lorne said that was thorough. Theo asked if Lorne was winning. Lorne said that he did not know yet, which was true. Theo said he should ask someone. Lorne said it did not work that way. Theo said that was inconvenient, and Lorne found that he had to turn away from the competition hall window to collect himself before he could respond. There was a man Lorne had met at the Guelph market 2 years earlier, a retired quality systems manager named Harold Frayne, who had spent 31 years in food manufacturing and had a particular talent for appearing at Lorne's table on the days when things needed to be said plainly. Harold had looked at Lorne's process documentation once without being asked, and had then sat on the cooler at the end of the table and told Lorne that what he was describing was not a small batch hobby. It was a proprietary method, and proprietary methods had legal weight, and legal weight required documentation with timestamps, and Harold and to know a food IP lawyer in Hamilton who owed him a favor from a zoning dispute in 2019. Lorne had resisted this for 6 months. Harold had not pushed. He had simply kept turning up at the market on Saturdays, buying the crabapple ferment he particularly liked, and saying nothing further about lawyers or timestamps until the day Lorne finally said yes. The documentation package Harold had helped him assemble over the following year was not intended as a weapon. It was intended as a record, because Harold was the kind of man who believed that accurate records were the only honest response to a world that sometimes chose to have a short memory. The package included time-stamped laboratory notes from Lorne's home setup going back 4 years, photographs of the culture development process, and a comparative analysis that Harold had commissioned from a retired food chemist, placing Lorne's botanical fermentation profile against the published specifications of Marchand Fine Foods' premium preserves line. Harold had given the package to a journalist named Sandra Okonkwo 6 weeks before the championship without Lorne's knowledge. Sandra covered food industry and intellectual property for a national business publication. She received the package, read it, and did not publish it. She was the kind of journalist who understood that a document being ready and a moment being ready were 2 different conditions, and the moment had not yet arrived. On the 3rd morning of the championship, Sylvie Marchand arrived 40 minutes before the judging panel was scheduled to convene. She had the competition brief open on her tablet and was reviewing the technical submissions. She had been reviewing them since 11 the previous night. She reached Lorne's innovation brief for the 3rd time and stopped at the page she had flagged, the table of flavor compound profiles. She had looked at this table before. She was looking at it differently now, with the specific attention of someone who has begun to recognize a shape they have seen before in another context. She called her Chief Product Development Officer in Montreal at 7 in the morning and asked 2 questions. The answers to those questions required her Product Development Officer to pull a file that was password protected on a server she had not personally reviewed in 8 months. The Product Development Officer called back in 11 minutes. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Sylvie sat in the green room of the competition venue and did not move for a while. She did not withdraw from the judging panel. She completed her role. She was professional in the full sense of the word, which meant that her personal situation did not alter her evaluation, and her evaluation was accurate. The scores were announced in the main hall at 4 on the 3rd afternoon, and the first-place aggregate across both divisions was Thornfield Kitchen, producer number 41, by a margin of 3 points. The announcement was clean and without drama, as competition announcements are when the scoring is unambiguous and the record is complete. Lorne stood at his station and did not perform anything. He looked at the number on the board for a moment and then looked at his hands. Bev had brought Theo to Toronto for the announcement, which Lorne had told her was not necessary, and which she had ignored. Theo came through the public entry with Captain in his jacket pocket and ran across the hall to where Lorne was standing. He arrived at significant speed and attached himself to his father's midsection with both arms. Lorne picked him up and held him against his shoulder, and Theo said into his father's collar that he knew. Lorne asked what he knew. Theo said that he knew this would happen. Lorne asked how. Theo said because Captain was a good spoon and good spoons knew things. Lorne did not answer that immediately because he needed a moment. The prize was presented by the competition chair, a formal ceremony with a small grandstand of remaining attendees and the kind of photography that goes into annual reports. Lorne accepted the certificate and the bank draft and answered the chair's questions about his process, in the particular way he answered questions he found interesting, which was completely and at whatever length was required. He thanked Harold by name. He mentioned Bev and the market and Margaret from the baked goods table. He did not mention Marchand Fine Foods. He did not mention the press release he had read at his kitchen table 4 years ago. He did not mention a county agricultural fair in May or a woman who had not tasted anything from an open jar on a folding table. Sandra Okonkwo was in the press section during the ceremony. She had already filed the competition story for the Saturday edition. After the ceremony, she opened the second file, the one that did not describe a competition but described a process and 2 documents and a timeline, and she published it that evening through the business section of her outlet, with Harold's comparative analysis attached as a supplementary document. She did not accuse anyone in the text of the article. She described a fermentation method, its documented origin date, and its subsequent appearance in a national brand's product line under different attribution. She asked in the final paragraph a single question about the distance between development and credit, and she left the answer as good journalists do to the reader. Lorne saw the article that night at the hotel after Theo was asleep in the second bed and Bev had gone back to her room. He read it twice. He put the phone down. He sat with it for a while in the way he sat with things, which was completely and without urgency. Then he called Harold. Harold picked up on the second ring, which was unusual for 11 at night, and said that he was glad Lorne had called, and that the IP lawyer in Hamilton had already been in touch, and that the next steps were clear if Lorne wanted to take them, and that Harold had merely assembled the facts because he was a man who assembled facts, and what Lorne did with them was Lorne's own business entirely. Lorne said he understood that, and thanked him, and meant it without qualification. The weeks after the championship had a quality of forward motion that Lorne had not felt in 4 years. Not the frantic motion of a situation changing faster than he could track it, but the steady confirmed motion of something that had been built correctly and was now operating as designed. He spoke with the IP lawyer, he reviewed options, he made decisions at the pace that decisions made well required, which was not slow exactly but was never faster than his understanding of the situation allowed. He kept going to the market on Saturdays, the table was the same, the jars were the same. Theo was there with Captain every second Saturday when school did not conflict, which Theo considered a scheduling problem and Lorne considered non-negotiable. Margaret from the baked goods table had seen the article before Lorne had and greeted him the Saturday after the championship by setting a piece of butter tart on his side of the partition without saying anything. He ate it and nodded, and that was sufficient. Sylvie Marchand called on a Wednesday. She did not use an assistant to place the call. She dialed from her personal number and identified herself when he answered and asked if he had time to talk. He said he did. She said that she had spent 3 weeks reviewing the origin documentation of the botanical fermentation line, and that the review had been thorough, and the findings were not in her favor, and that she was calling to say this to him directly because the alternative was having it said for her by a process server, and that was not the kind of person she intended to be. She said that she had built her company on a commitment to genuine craft and genuine sourcing, and that what had occurred was a violation of that commitment that had happened within her organization without her knowledge, and that not knowing was an explanation but not a defense. She stopped there. She did not attempt to reframe what had happened as ambiguous or procedural or subject to interpretation. Lorne said he believed that she had not known. He said it without hedging because he had considered her carefully and found on balance that it was true. He also said that not knowing had not altered the outcome for him, or for the 4 years of work that had been taken from him and used under another name, and that this was not an accusation but a fact, and he thought facts should be stated plainly. She received this without deflecting it. The call lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, they had agreed to a meeting in Toronto with their respective legal counsel and no one else present. Sylvie said that her lawyers would not be in the room to negotiate. They would be there to document what she and Lorne decided. He said that was how it should be. The meeting produced an agreement. Lorne did not describe its terms publicly except in the settlement filing, which became part of a public record when all parties confirmed it. What he did say, in a brief statement he released through Sandra Okonkwo's outlet, was that the outcome acknowledged the origin of the work and that this was what he had wanted from the beginning. Not the money, though the money was part of it, but the acknowledgement of where the thing had actually come from and who had made it. The workshop idea had been forming since before the championship. Not a production facility, not a brand, a space. A kitchen and a lab, properly equipped, accessible to food producers in the region who had serious ideas and limited infrastructure. A place where the work that cannot be done at a folding table in a garden shed could be done with the tools it needed, and where people who were working carefully on something genuinely new could do it in the company of others doing the same. He had not filed anything yet. The idea was in the notebook stage, which for Lorne was the stage where something was real but not yet committed to a timeline. He had, however, measured the empty commercial unit 2 blocks from the market and stood in it for an hour one morning taking notes. Sylvie came to the Guelph market on the last Saturday of September. She came alone, no assistant, no photographer, no lanyard. She found the Thornfield kitchen table in its usual place along the east wall and stood in front of it for a moment before Theo, who was arranging jars in order of height with the systematic attention he brought to organizing tasks, looked up and recognized her. He recognized her because Lorne had, without making a production of it, shown him her photograph once and explained, in the plain language he used with Theo for important things, that this was a person who had said something unkind about their table and who had later understood that she was wrong, and that both of those things could be true about a person. Theo had asked several follow-up questions that Lorne had answered as completely as he could. Theo had then asked whether she would come to the market, and Lorne had said he did not know. Theo had said he thought she probably would, eventually, because people who understood they were wrong usually wanted to see the thing they had been wrong about. Theo looked at Sylvie now with the direct, unmediated assessment he applied to everyone, and asked if she was the lady from the fair. She said yes. He asked if she wanted to try the apple butter. She said she would like that. He opened the demonstration jar on the table and offered her a spoon, and she took it and tasted it and stood there for a moment after. She said it was extraordinary. She said it in the way that people who do not often use that word use it when there is no other word that is accurate. Theo said he knew. He said his dad had been making it for a long time and it kept getting better. Sylvie said she believed that. Theo said that Captain agreed. Sylvie asked who Captain was. Theo produced the wooden spoon from his jacket pocket and introduced them in the formal way he reserved for important occasions. Sylvie said hello to Captain with the exact tone and seriousness that the introduction required, and Theo decided, on the basis of this, that she was all right. Lorne had been watching from the end of the table, adjusting a jar label that did not need adjusting. He moved back to his position behind the table and looked at Sylvie. She met it without adjusting her posture, and he found, examining her in that plain light, that the version of her he saw now was the version of her that was actually there, without the distance of the other times, and that it was a person he could be in conversation with without any remainder. She asked if he had found a space yet for the workshop. He asked how she knew about the workshop. She said that Harold Frayne was not a man who kept things entirely to himself when he thought information was useful, and that she had a proposal she wanted to put to him if he was interested, not an acquisition, not a partnership with her name on the outside, but a founding contribution that would belong to the space and not to her, in exchange for being part of the conversation about what the space was for. Lorne looked at her for long enough that the question was settled for him. Then he said she could come by on Wednesday, and that the space was 2 blocks north of where they were standing, and that there was a good coffee place on the corner. She said she would find it. Theo had been listening to this from his position beside the jar display, holding Captain and watching the two of them with the evaluating attention of someone who has considered a situation carefully and is not yet done considering it. When Sylvie said goodbye and turned to go, Theo called after her and said that the crabapple ferment was also very good if she wanted to take a jar. She turned back, she took a jar. She paid for it, waved off the market bag, and walked toward the east entrance with it in her hand. Theo watched her go. Then he turned to Lorne and said, with the settled authority of a 7-year-old who has reached a conclusion, that she tasted it this time. Lorne said that she did. Theo said that was the right thing to do. Lorne said he thought so too. The market closed at 2. They loaded the truck the way they always loaded it. Jars wrapped in cloth and packed in order, the cooler secured at the back, the folding table strapped to the side rail. Theo rode in the passenger seat with Captain across his knees. On the way home he asked whether the workshop would have a good kitchen. Lorne said it would have an excellent kitchen. Theo asked whether he could come sometimes. Lorne said he could come whenever he wanted. Theo said that Captain would also need to come, because a good kitchen needed someone in charge. Lorne said that was understood. They drove home through the early autumn light, and when they pulled into the driveway, the shed at the end of the garden was visible through the back gate, and the crocs inside it were doing what they had been doing for 4 years, slowly and without hurry, turning simple things into something that could not be replicated by anyone who had not done the time.